Good evening, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Wherever you're tuning in from, we're so happy to have you here. My name is Melissa Ho. I'm curator of 20th century art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Shipu Wang, who is the Coates Family Chair in the Arts and Professor of Art History at the University of California, Merced. He is also currently the Hannah and Russell Cully Distinguished Fellow in American Art at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens. And most pertinent to our program tonight, he is the exhibition curator of Pictures of Belonging, Miki Hayakawa, Hisako Hibi, and Mine Okubo. This touring exhibition is organized by the Japanese American National Museum, and it is currently proudly presented here in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, coordinated by myself and Anna Lee. Dr. Wan's research has long centered around illuminating and reevaluating the work and legacy of American artists of Asian descent during the early and mid-20th century, and with a special focus on Nikkei artists or artists of Japanese descent. His rigorous scholarship and his advocacy have had tremendous impact on the field, challenging and expanding the boundaries of American art history. He specifically asked me to keep my introduction of him brief, so I will not name all his activities and publications, except to call out one, which is this cover article of the current issue of American Art, the Journal of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. This issue and his essay, which focuses on Nikkei collectives of interwar California, is very, very worth seeking out. Dr. Wang is speaking to us tonight from where he lives in Los Angeles, a city that is very much in our thoughts, and I join others here in sending much love and support to the people who are hurting there. Finally, as some of you may know, we recently lost Ibuki Hibi Lee. Ibuki Lee was, among many other things, the daughter of Hisako and Masuroburo Hibi, and without her, Pictures of Belonging would not have been possible. And we present this program tonight in her honor. Thank you, and without further ado, I pass the mic to Shipu Wang.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Melissa and the Smithsonian American Art Museum for hosting Pictures of Belonging. Special thanks also go to the Japanese American National Museum, or JANM, the organizing institution for the exhibition and its national tour. I'm deeply grateful to you and all the museum partners for joining us on this special journey. I also want to recognize the national and local sponsors, especially the Terra Foundation for American Art and the National Endowment for the Arts. Your generous funding made this exhibition a reality. It has been moving to see people from diverse backgrounds encounter the work of these trailblazing artists for the first time. Their responses, often deeply meaningful and sometimes emotional, have been truly inspiring. To be honest, when I first learned about the paintings of Miki Hayakawa, Hisako Hibi, and Mine Okubo more than 20 years ago, I never imagined I would have the honor of curating an exhibition of their art, let alone one that would tour nationally. And I'll admit, when I started this project, I underestimated just how challenging it would be to bring together the three fascinating lives and prolific careers that spanned 8 decades and 4 US states. I needed to find artworks that are good on their own merit, but can also represent key moments in the artist's development. For me, this meant committing to a long process of rediscovery. It involved diving into archives and collections, identifying previously unknown artworks, spending months or even years tracking down leads, and traveling across the country to view and assess works. On top of that, it required me to stay patient, a quality I thought I innately lacked, and invest years in earning the trust of artist estates, private collectors, and institutions. I'm grateful to Ibuki Hibi Lee and her family, Seiko Buckingham and her board of trustees, Mr. Richard Sakai, and all the lenders for allowing us to take their treasured pieces on the road for 3 years. The exhibition checklist grew to have more than 100 artworks and photos, many of which have never been publicly displayed or reproduced. Many of the art pieces needed special care before they could safely be exhibited. That included professional shipping, conservation, and in many cases, framing or reframing, all of which requires significant funding. As a full-time art history professor at the University of California, Merced, and an independent curator not tied to any museum, I needed an institution to organize this project. I'm thus incredibly grateful for the unwavering support of Ann Burroughs, JNM's president and CEO, and her team who helped realize this exhibition. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the impact and trailblazer in rediscovering and studying many Issei and Nisei artists. Their artworks may have been lost forever had it not been Karen's sustained efforts in showing and bringing some of them into JNM's collection. This current exhibition owes much debt to Karen's consequential work that started more than 30 years ago. JNM's commitment to realizing pictures of belonging, as well as the partner museum's belief in this project, are especially appreciated, considering that this exhibition was not an easy sell, because more than a dozen museum colleagues either turned down the proposal or didn't respond. Museums weigh many factors when deciding on exhibitions, of course. In this case, the limited recognition of these artists have been a contributing challenge. Few people, including specialists in American art, knew or know these names or much about their full bodies of work. One has to look hard to find mentions, if any, of these artists in publications about 20th century American or even California art. Even fewer museum collections of American art have works by these artists, although that's now changing, and I will talk a bit about that at the end. You will see some newer acquisitions in museum collections noted in yellow credit lines throughout this presentation, by the way. The underrepresentation or even absence of Hayakawa, Hibi, and Okubo in major American art museums was curious because they were in fact three of the most active and critically acclaimed American artists who were women of Japanese descent of the pre-World War II generations. Their long and productive careers all began in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1920s and 30s, continued even in wartime and post-war years, and in the case of Hibi and Okubo, flourished well into the 1980s and 90s. By sharing the range and depth of these artists' work with a national audience, Pictures of Belonging contributes to recent efforts in the field of American art and museum to present a more complete and nuanced picture of this country's artistic and cultural history. These artists' diverse artworks showcase their talent and skills. They also reveal important and intimate moments in the artist's personal journeys that, in turn, point to their involvement in vibrant and diverse communities, from San Francisco to the incarceration camps, to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and New York City. By bringing their works together for the first time, this exhibition in effect combines three mini retrospectives into one, creating a unique reunion that highlights the long and productive connections among the three artists. The visual dialogue between their artworks, seen throughout the exhibition and in the catalog, demonstrate that these artists did not work in isolation or limit themselves to specific racial ethnic groups. Instead, they were deeply engaged members of broader American art communities and collectives, a rich history that has not been fully explored in previous exhibitions or publications. In this regard, Pictures of Belonging is more than a collection of illustrated biographies. It asks broader guiding questions, such as, what does the so-called American experience look like through the eyes of these immigrant, diasporic, and minority artists? How did they participate in and contribute to the development of 20th century American art? What stories does their art tell us that are missing from existing US history? And in what ways do they belong in the history of American art? These questions guided my choice for several purposes. It highlights the artist's personal stories of migration, assimilation, both in art and life, building multi-ethnic and multicultural communities, and finding a sense of belonging. At the same time, the title poses an implicit challenge. Why have these artists, despite their impressive bodies of work and sustained achievements, been absent or even excluded from the canon of American art? The scope of the exhibition also illustrates these artists' perseverance in building their long and prolific careers, a truly remarkable feat considering that they lived through the exclusion era, 1882 to 1965, which was characterized by U.S. laws that targeted, restricted, and prevented Asian immigrants from becoming naturalized U.S. citizens, among other consequential policies. Such pervasive xenophobia eventually contributed to the removal and incarceration of more than 150,000 Japanese Americans after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. It is also worth noting that this was the era when women, and certainly Issei women who immigrated from Japan, did not have much freedom or many options in being independent and pursuing their own careers, not to mention becoming full-fledged fine artists. Hayakawa, Hibi, and Okubo are, in this regard, true outliers and trailblazers. Their artworks and life stories illustrate the diversity of Japanese American women that cannot be flattened into a monolithic label or category. Neither their shared identity as women of Japanese descent, nor the trauma and injustice of wartime experience define or confine their artistic pursuit. So in the next section of my talk, I'd like to take you on a highly abbreviated time travel to get a sense of these artists' lives and works. Of course, these are simply selective biographical sketches. The full extent of their individual work and stories awaits further study. Hayakawa, the oldest of the three, began her formal art training at the California School of Fine Arts in 1923. Hibi began taking classes at the same school in 1926. Incidentally, the CSFA, later renamed San Francisco Art Institute, sadly closed down in 2022. Thankfully, though, the school's rich archives remain in the diligent care of longtime librarian and archivist Jeff Gunderson and his colleague Becky Alexander. I'm grateful to both of them for all the research assistance over the years. It was Becky who called my attention to this precious photo. Here we see a live model class at the CSFA in 1927 and get a glimpse of Hayakawa as an art student. Can you spot her? There she is. Because there are no known Hayakawa papers, I had to comb through the school's enrollment records in the 1920s in order to identify all the classes she took and get a better sense of her training. From what I was able to gather, Hayakawa had a special interest in portraiture and figurative work and was pretty good at them. Her teachers, including trailblazing female instructors Constance Mackey and Gertrude Albright, consistently gave her high marks. She was winning prizes early in her student years, and her artworks were featured in the school's seasonal catalogs. We were able to include 3 of her nudes from this period, but I've seen dozens of her charcoal drawings, all of which demonstrate her skills and dedication to her craft. In fact, she was so prolific that by the time she held her first solo exhibition in Kimon Gaguen, or the Golden Gate Institute in San Francisco in 1929, she was reported to have shown 150 paintings, with some 50 more at home. The exhibition venue is historically significant. It was established in 1911 by the Japanese community to remedy the negative effects of xenophobic policies, among other things, by ensuring that Japanese immigrants' children received proper and well-rounded education in both Japanese and English. The Institute also became a vital center for community and cultural activities, such as hosting art exhibitions. Hayakawa and Hisako Shimizu, later Mrs. Hibi, were both in the 2 group shows put on by the San Francisco Japanese Artists Association in 1929 in 1930. Their fellow exhibitors included Chiura Obata, Matsusaburo Hibi, Henry Sugimoto, Hideo Benjamin Noda, Edward Taylor, and many other artists. And to show you how prolific Hayakawa was, here is a list of exhibits she participated in with more than 160 works, all in 1929. I have not come across any pictures of the 1929 solo show, unfortunately, but I know that critics unanimously recognize Hayakawa's artistic talent and skills. Gobin Bihari Lal, writing for San Francisco Examiner, used the word genius to describe Hayakawa and praised her tremendous industry with no slipshod work. He also admired Hayakawa's keen observation, supple fingers, and irrepressible flashes in her brushwork. To the critic, Hayakawa's work represented the full blossom of the Occidental art of painting, and he attributed Hayakawa's success to her being in San Francisco's cosmopolitan environment. Quote, the prophets of a new Renaissance have said so often that here, if anywhere, the East and the West will meet and pool their talents and begin new creative romances in cultural history, unquote. That sense of generative meetings of cultures and talents is nicely illustrated by this pair of portraits in Pictures of Belonging. They came from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, or LACMA, which acquired them from the late pioneering collector of Asian American art, Michael D. Brown, back in 2004, thanks to the foresight of curators Eileen Ford and Bruce Robertson. Hayakawa's brushwork enables the viewer to see and imagine the model's pulsating energy manifesting on the surfaces of the canvas. It is as if Hayakawa were trying to paint the dignified man from the inside out through deploying an intricate play of tonality and shapes that reveal, or at least suggest, the inner qualities of her sitter. The result is a luminous portrait of a man whose light seems to emanate from his reflective skin as well as from within. And as if demonstrating his own skills and their stylistic differences, Yoongi, a fellow artist and student at the same school, added a third figure that mediates between Hayakawa's realism and his semi-abstraction. The contrast between the figures offers a visual dialogue between the two artists' approaches to the same subject. Adding the portrait of G by his mentor and teacher Otis Ofield, also in LACMA's collection, we have a vibrant picture of what the critic meant by San Francisco being a multi-ethnic and multicultural environment in which Hayakawa flourished. Law's review actually contains another precious clue to Hayakawa's life that I was unaware of, until years later I located the full page of the newspaper. The article was in fact accompanied by an illustration with the caption, "Reading Post of Miss Shimizu." A light bulb went off in my head. Isn't Shimizu Hisako Hibi's maiden name before she became Mrs. Hibi in 1930? So here is a portrait of Hisako by Miki. This is a kind of history's mystery that I get excited about, even though the portrait's whereabouts remain unknown. It is especially exciting because I had known this photo of the trio that you see on the screen for 20 years, but because there's no Hayakawa estate or extant papers, and curiously, little sign of Hayakawa in the Hibi papers either, there had not been a way to further ascertain their friendship. This black and white newspaper reproduction is as close as we can get as a piece of evidence. And with additional photos of Miki and Hisako from 1927 that emerged from the Hibi estate only a couple years ago, we now have more visual evidence of that social group. Matsusaburo Hibi and Hisako Shimizu got married in 1930, and the couple moved to Hayward, California to start their family. They had a son Satoshi and a daughter Ibuki. Matsusaburo worked at the Mount Eden Japanese language school for a period, and Hisako was a full-time mom. Ibuki told me that one of her enduring memories of her parents was that they would spend time painting together, and the kids would join in too. Hisako did continue to submit her painting to various jewelry shows in the San Francisco Bay Area. Unfortunately, few of her paintings from this period survived, as most of Hebe's pre-war artworks were lost due to the forced displacement during wartime. And Hisako wrote on the back of one of her canvases that she only managed to keep 4 paintings with her when they had to abandon their home. Thanks to the paintings rediscovered by a local resident and donated to the Hayward Area Historical Society, we can at least get a sense of Hisako Hebe's interest in painting landscape with her own imaginative interpretation, as seen in this canvas that's been conserved and included in the current exhibition. The 1930s proved to be a highly productive decade for all 3 artists. Hayakawa achieved such critical acclaim that she was chosen in 1935 to be in the opening exhibition of the new San Francisco Museum of Art. I'm thrilled that we were able to have both paintings in the exhibition, thanks to the New Mexico Museum Art, as well as Sandy and Bram Dijkstra and the Huntington Library Art Museum and Botanical Gardens. Hayakawa's intricately rendered From My Window shows the iconic Koi Tower overlooking the developing modern metropolis. And her One Afternoon is a masterfully painted, deeply personal, yet enigmatic portrait of an intimate moment with a man who appeared in many of Hayakawa's paintings from this period. We don't know for sure, but based on several portraits that I have been able to locate, especially those in Richard Sakai's collection, we can see the recurring figures' similar features. And we even have a possible name, Edward, thanks to the note by Hayakawa's friend Matteo Latunic, who donated the ukulele player portrait to the Monterey Museum of Art, one of the venues for this touring exhibition. Who this Edward was and why Hayakawa chose to represent this intimate partner with an averted gaze, absorbed in his own world in all of the portraits, remain a mystery waiting to be solved. It is my hope that when the exhibition is in Monterey, someone may come forward and identify this man. As Hayakawa achieved critical acclaim, Mine Okubo was just beginning her career, leaving Riverside, California, where she was born, to pursue her art degrees at the University of California, Berkeley. A fellowship enabled her to travel to Europe and study art. And she was already developing her unique artistic style, but we can see in her paintings from this period her admiration for European art and the Italian Renaissance frescoes, particularly in terms of the composition and modeling of the figures. And she began to receive greater recognition for her art after her return. For example, her Mio and Cat, a memorial painting of her mother who passed away in 1940, won the M. Bremer Memorial Prize at the 1941 San Francisco Art Association annual exhibition. Having witnessed her mother give up her own promising art career to raise a family of 7 kids, Okubo would later recall that she learned early on that, quote, I never wanted to marry to serve the men, unquote. Indeed, she never got married or had children. The years right before World War II was also the period when she was creating ambitious paintings inspired by the work of Mexican muralists, such as José Clemente Orozco, whom she admired, and Diego Rivera. In these 2 paintings in Pictures of Belonging, you can observe up close her techniques that are reminiscent of those used in fresco painting. She was even invited to serve as a fresco technique demonstrator near the site where Rivera was painting his Pan-American Unity mural at the Golden Gate International Exposition in 1940. Here is a glimpse of Okubo in a silent film showcasing the more famous Diego Rivera. Okubo's other paintings, along with those by Hayakawa and Hebe, were selected to be in exhibitions at the exposition, making them the only 3 women of Japanese descent who share the distinction of representing American art at this high-profile World's Fair. That recognition must have meant a great deal for all 3 artists, as they had been putting in the work in the preceding decade. We can see how active they were from the decades of exhibition records that I combed through to identify which shows they were in and what works they displayed. By the way, I included my archival research findings in the exhibition catalog that will hopefully be useful to other researchers and projects. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 changed Japanese American lives forever. President Roosevelt declared war, and the U.S. residents of Japanese descent, including American citizens, were labeled as enemies. Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 then authorized their removal from the Western Defense Zone. They were asked to abandon their homes and move away from the West Coast. If they did not leave on their own, they were forced into detention centers, incarceration camps, and even prison camps run by the Justice Department. From the scant information we have, it appears that Hayakawa was one of those who left California, her home for more than 30 years, and moved to New Mexico, taking many of her paintings with her, including these. In Santa Fe, she found a new community of artists and became an active member, participating in group shows and staging solo shows as well, even during wartime. With my exhaustive pursuit and the help of surviving photos, such as this one of Hayakawa's 1944 exhibit at the New Mexico Museum of Art, I have been able to identify many of her supposedly lost works in private hands, and here they are. This is largely thanks to dedicated collectors like Richard Sakai, who has been incredibly generous in sharing with me his impressive collection of art by Asian American and especially Japanese American artists. I'm grateful that several of these are in pictures of belonging. In Santa Fe, Hayakawa was said to have been involved in the famed American artist John Sloan's group and hosted their gatherings on occasion. Her art circles also included fellow artist Preston Elmer McCrossan, whom she married in 1948. Unfortunately, in the decades after her death in 1953, Hayakawa's many artworks were sold and dispersed, and none of her personal papers appear to have survived, although I'm still holding out hope that someday something just might turn up somewhere. Hibi and Okubo were also forced to leave their homes in California, but they were sent into incarceration camps. First to the Temperance Assembly Center in San Bruno, California in May 1942, and later to the Central Utah Relocation Center, known as Topaz, near Delta in Utah. Under incarceration, Hisako helped and taught at the Topaz Art School, established by her husband, Matsusaburo Hibi, and their close friend and fellow San Francisco artist, Chiura Obata. Matsusaburo Hibi took over as the art school's director after Obata left Topaz in 1943 following an attack that landed Obata in the hospital. Mine Okubo also taught art classes at Topaz, by the way. The art school held not only classes, but also exhibitions, with the final art show taking place in June 1945. Here we see three of the Hibi family members, with little Ibuki always standing by her daddy's side in group photos. Ibuki, nicknamed Peekaboo, was the consummate model for her parents. Her brother Satoshi made a few appearances as well. While raising two young children, Hisako Hibi stayed productive and painted more than 100 canvases at Temperance and Topaz. The majority of these works were donated to Janum by Ibuki after the museum organized the Hisako Hibi retrospective in 1999. You can see all four portraits on the screen in the current exhibition. Hibi's paintings capture not only the people, but also their harsh living conditions. Yet she found beauty even under difficult circumstances, using art as a vital tool to cope, make sense of her experiences, and find temporary relief from the surrounding chaos and turmoil. We see similar approaches in Okubo's work as she became more prolific than ever under incarceration. Here you can get a sense of how diverse her artwork was and how determined she was to stay productive during a period of displacement and challenge. She also used her pen and brush to capture the collective experience, as seen in her now iconic graphic memoir, which was published in 1946 and won the prestigious American Book Award in 1984. It is considered a graphic memoir because Okubo incorporated her own likeness into all the scenes she depicted, acting as the narrator, who also went through displacement and incarceration firsthand. Her simple lines succinctly encapsulate the traumatic experience of many Japanese Americans. Her keen observation, often injected with her signature acerbic humor, renders this group of imagery a historically significant and deeply insightful body of work that has become the most well-known and studied work by Okubo. While she taught art classes in the art school and created images for Topaz Incarceree's Trek magazine, she mostly wanted to be left alone to focus on her art making. She would put up a quarantine sign on her door to prevent people from interrupting her work, also telling camp officials that she had communicable diseases. At the same time, she stayed connected with the outside world through her art, including sending many greeting cards and letters that she drew. She even managed to submit her paintings to exhibitions as far as Chicago to maintain her identity as a working artist and a member of the broader artistic community. It was her monochromatic tempera painting on watch she sent to the San Francisco Art Association's exhibit in 1943 and appeared on its catalog cover that attracted Fortune magazine's attention. It led to their inviting Okubo to work on an assignment to produce illustrations for their special Japan issue that came out in April 1944. We can now recognize this assignment as problematic and racially essentializing because Okubo, a US-born citizen, had never visited Japan and would not have had any special first-hand knowledge of how Japanese people actually lived at the time. Yet, because of her Japanese ancestry, Fortune asked her to create imagery about Japan, ostensibly assuming the authenticity of her visual representation of a country as foreign to her as her fellow Americans. However, Fortune's invitation did eventually allow her to apply to leave Topaz, move to New York in 1944, and go on to have an active career as an illustrator for major publications. But starting a new life in wartime New York as a Japanese American and a single woman trying to make a living as an artist was a struggle, as she shared in her 1944 Christmas card and letter to her older brother, artist Benji Okubo, who was incarcerated at Wyoming's Heart Mountain Camp. She also wrote about the challenge and excitement of building a new life in her letter to the Hebes, dated March 1944. We don't know if it had any impact on the Hebes, but they did choose to move to New York City as well, a month before Topaz finally closed on October 31st, 1945. I have not come across evidence of their social interaction while living in New York, but Okubo did stay in touch with the Hebes for decades to come, sending letters to Hisako on special occasions. The Hebe family struggled to find housing, but ended up living in a tenement building on the border of New York City's Hell's Kitchen. Hisako worked as a seamstress at one point at the famed Charles James, and then as a garment factory worker to support her family. But barely 2 years after regaining their freedom, Matsusaburo passed away from cancer in 1947, and Hisako became widowed with 2 young children to raise. The few paintings she managed to create from this period give us a glimpse of her experience, including this work that I saw on the floor of Ibuki's living room when I first visited. The painting seems at first glance unremarkable, perhaps an artist's rendition of everyday objects as worn by Matsusaburo in their photo of visiting New York Central Park. But I was immediately drawn to it precisely because of its understated quality. There was something haunting about it, I thought. Then I saw the inscription on the back of the canvas and learned that Hisako Hebe painted this less than 2 months after her husband passed away. As such, this unassuming painting is actually a posthumous portrait that takes on much more personal significance. The hat and coat hanging on the door looks as if Matsusaburo would at any moment reappear to use them. Yet Hisako's faint wash creates a kind of phantasmal background and adds to a poignant depiction of an empty shell, a memorial of what remains and that which was lost. For this exhibition, I decided to include Matsusaburo's portrait of Hisako created at Topaz so that they could in fact go on this national tour together. We've also included both in the exhibition catalog and on the wall labels a drawing by 10-year-old Ibuki of her father's hat and coat as well. From these few paintings that Hisako Hibi managed to produce during a time of grief and struggle, she called it her gray period. We can see shifts in her brushwork, choices of color, and an increasing depth of emotional complexity. She eventually moved back to San Francisco in 1954 and began the 37-year second chapter of her artistic life. She moved towards semi-abstraction and developed a layered construction of paint through deliberate and contemplative brushstrokes and colors. She talked about how she had struggled for years to feel free, to allow herself to find her own voice and vision for her art. As a lifelong Buddhist, she reflected deeply on life's lessons, including the impermanence and cyclical nature of existence, and sought inner peace through her art making. She indeed pursued this goal tirelessly until the end of her life, persevering through multiple cancer diagnoses and treatments while continuing to paint. For Okubo, in her nearly 6 decades of living in New York, she produced and accumulated thousands of artworks in a small, rent-controlled apartment in Greenwich Village. After her death, her niece and nephew sorted through the immense collection, moved it back to California, and dispersed their artworks across several institutions, including the Center for Social Justice and Civil Liberties in Riverside, her hometown, where thousands of Okubo's works and documents reside. These photos, for example, all come from the Okubo archives at the center within the Riverside Community College district. So do many of the paintings in our current exhibition. By the way, because we borrowed many works for pictures of belonging and left empty spots on the gallery walls, I ended up curating another retrospective for the center that opened in April 2024 and will be on display for a while. So if you want to see even more Okubo artworks, some quite different from those in Pictures of Belonging, please visit Riverside. The sheer volume and variety of artworks indicate an artist who was determined to keep pushing herself to experiment with and develop new techniques and imagery. As we can see in these larger canvases with vibrant colors and free-flowing lines. They are the result of Okubo's intentional process of taking everything back to the basic, in her own words. She forced herself to unlearn her formal training in order to express a vision that's uniquely her own, and she was tireless in her pursuit. In fact, both Okubo and Hibi made art into their 80s and amassed impressive numbers of works that mostly stayed with them and later their family members. Neither artist sought commercial gallery representation to sell their art, which likely contributed, at least in part, to their being less well-known names nationally. However, they were active and beloved members of various art communities in San Francisco and New York City. Hibi, for example, was an early and longtime supporter of the San Francisco Women Artists Association. Okubo was involved with a few groups, including at one point Basement Workshop, an Asian American artist collective in New York. Okubo also contributed to the historic movement that pushed for the restitution of civil rights, an apology, and/or monetary compensation from the US government for its role in the mass removal and confinement of Japanese Americans during World War II. In 1981, she even testified in Congress in front of the US Commission on War Relocation and Internment of Civilians and submitted a copy of Citizen 13660 into congressional records. She also created illustrations of congressional hearings for various publications throughout the 80s. Both artists got their flowers later in life. Okubo received a few retrospectives and Lifetime Achievement Awards. In our touring exhibition, by the way, you can watch an interview of Okubo by fellow artist Betty Latuc on the occasion of Okubo's Lifetime Achievement Award from the Women's Caucus for Art in 1991. There, you will also see Hisako Hibi featured in a public television program in 1977, almost a decade before she had a banner year in 1986 at the age of 79. She had a retrospective and received awards and honors, including the declaration by San Francisco's then mayor, Dianne Feinstein, of June 14th as Mrs. Hisako Hibi Day. On the screen, you can see a photo of Hibi with Rusasawa, the now world-famous artist whose artworks command millions of dollars these days. I thought it was endearing to see the way they held on to each other's arms in some photos because it suggests their friendship and their support for each other as fellow artists and Japanese American art women. One cannot help but wonder how Hayakawa's art would have developed had she not passed away in 1953 at the age of almost 54. It would be reasonable to assume that she would have continued to develop her artistic skills and expressions, seen in some surviving paintings that she created in Santa Fe, just as Hibi and Kubo did into their later years. These biographical sketches, obviously abbreviated, hopefully have given you a sense of these trailblazers' lives and offer some answers to the questions I posed earlier. Perhaps today's talk would even inspire you to check out the touring exhibition at one of its stops and get a copy of the accompanying catalog, co-published by Janum and the University of California Press, made possible by a generous grant from the Terra Foundation for American Art. The publication contains writings by a diverse group of contributors that address various topics concerning the artist's biographies, communities, artistic development, and the importance of archival and museum work. These writings provide useful context for the artist's bodies of work and guide the reader through the three loosely chronological sections containing a total of 169 images, dozens more than the physical artworks we were able to show in the traveling exhibition. It is certainly my hope that the publication will provide helpful resources for future study. Speaking of the future, there has been another surprising benefit from curating this exhibition that I had not anticipated, and it is already making a material impact in the field of American art. With the artist's estate's trust and blessing, I have had the pleasure of connecting them with museum curators who were enthusiastic about acquiring works by these artists. Some of these artists' works are entering major art museum collections in the US for the very first time. For instance, I worked with Sam's Melissa Ho and was thrilled when the Smithsonian acquired several paintings by the Hebes in late 2022 and in 2023, 3 works by Okubo. All 3 you see on the screen are traveling in pictures of belonging. And there have been others too, including these that were among the Hebe paintings that entered the Brooklyn Museum's collection in 2023. Such acquisitions increase major American art museums' representation of Japanese American artists. And along with the donation of artist papers, such as those of the Hebes to the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, more people now have access to see and study these artists' works and lives. They enable art institutions to show the full diversity of American artistic communities across the country, and to tell more complete and nuanced stories of 20th century American art. For that, I want to again recognize the artist estates and dedicated collectors for preserving these treasures. In Ibuki's case, she had been steadfast in safeguarding and championing her parents' artworks for many, many decades. I understand, as a son of 2 painters, that it is both a privilege and in some ways burden that one has to shoulder. I'm glad that in the past 10 years, I've had the pleasure of getting to know Ibuki, earning her trust, and helping her and her family ensure that the Hebe's artistic legacy lives on. And if I may, as I did in the exhibition catalog, I want to dedicate this exhibition to my mother, Cai-Ling Dai, a painter, music teacher, choir conductor, dressmaker, and a lifelong learner. When Parkinson's-related dementia began to ravage her brain, she shared a rare moment of candor with me. wistfully reflecting on her unfulfilled potential because of her expected duties as a wife and mother in a patriarchal society. I was surprised and sad to hear that. 3 months after she passed away in June 2021, I completed the proposal for Pictures of Belonging. In a way, this is also an exhibition that honors her. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shipu, for that incredibly well constructed and very generous talk. To everyone in the audience, please enter any questions you have for our speaker into the Q&A box. We have about 15 minutes for questions. And to get the ball rolling, I'll start off, Shipu, where you ended with your mention of your mother, another female painter. And I'm curious to ask you if you could expand on the three artists, Hayakawa, Hebe, and Okubo, and what you know about what the roles of wife and mother meant to them. You know, the subject, it's striking to me that the subject of motherhood and the relationship between parent and child is in fact a repeated subject in both the work of Okubo and Hebe. And as you've shared with us tonight, the three had very different lives. And so I'd be curious to hear your reflections on that topic.
Yeah, thank you for that. I I wanted to bring three very different life paths together, especially to show the diversity of their choices and also circumstances. And in a way, I'm not trying to tell a specific narrative about what being a quote unquote female artist meant in those times, but also to sort of open up the discussion to say there is a variety of possibilities and people did make different choices. And connecting that with their subject matter, it also does not confine or define what they chose to paint as artists. And so I mentioned that at one point in my talk is that that label is too simplistic. And I think that point is conveyed through a collective show like this, so that you actually get a variety of interpretations and situations as you walk through the exhibition.
Thank you. I see a question in the Q&A that actually I know others, visiting our presentation of the show in Washington have posed as well. So I want to repose it to you, which is to ask you to address the title of the exhibition, Pictures of Belonging, and maybe unpack your thinking on that title a bit for us.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that in part of the talk, and it was pretty brief, is the belonging is a description, but belonging is also a question. Belonging is a intervention, almost an assertion, but it could also be open to interpretation. And and the idea is that it's not a prescription to put on an exhibition to tell the viewer what decision they should make, but to offer these resources, these actual artworks, and people can come in and make their decision. And now some people may say, well, I think their artwork is so good that they belong in the American canon, and that will be one interpretation. But it's also possible that some people just don't respond to their work and say, well, okay, that this is probably why. And so in a way, it's to also ask for everyone to have a conversation, to think about these issues: who gets in, who gets out, who is put on the walls, who does not, who belong in the collection to be preserved forever, hopefully, and who's not. Yeah, so that's at least that's what I'm trying to get at with that simple title.
Another question from the Q&A box. How much interaction did these three artists have with Obata, other than in the incarceration camp, which you did touch on?
Yes, and it seems like they did have interaction. We don't have a lot of direct evidence, except that the Obata family was quite close with the Hebe family. And I believe the story goes that Obata was the one in who was in Japan to convince Hisako Hebe's parents, Hisako Shimizu at the time, to allow them to let their daughter marry Matsusaburo, who was much older. And at least that's the story. And I also have seen photos of Obata visiting the memorial exhibition of Matsusaburo that Hisako helped stage after the war, and which was interesting because Hisako Hibi let her husband had the first retrospective in the post-war period, even though she was still creating. And then she also later on quite a few years later, had her own exhibition. And in those occasions, you see the Obata family members, including Haruko Obata, in those pictures. So they were pretty close, and obviously Topaz Art School was the place for artists to work together, to provide instruction, and they would also paint together. So, and we don't know the extent of Okubo's connection, but obviously she was invited. She was at UC Berkeley and she was invited to contribute to the art school as well.
Did Okubo and Obata know each other from Berkeley as well, from before the war?
I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me.
Right.
And I did see that they were in several exhibitions together. So they obviously were in the similar circles, participating in different similar activities, and two of them, actually both of them, got exhibitions right before the war, almost back to back. I mean, just within the same year too. So yeah,
Very likely they knew each other and knew each other's work
yeah.
well. Um, Here's an interesting question that I'm very curious about as well. Do you know if any of these incredible artists were known in Japan or elsewhere in Asia during or after their lifetimes?
The short answer is no, I don't think so. There had been one or two exhibitions. I believe Janum was involved in a traveling exhibition that was organized by a Japanese curator. And that exhibition was the first one in Japan to really show Japanese American artists who were incarcerated and the kind of art they produced. So the exposure has been quite limited. And they really didn't visit Japan much. So Hayakawa, there's no indication that she ever went back to Japan to visit her relatives. And Hisako Hibi later in the 60s and 70s, I believe, made some visits, but that's about it. And as far as I know, even when we brought the Chiura Obata retrospective to Japan, that was quite new for a lot of the audiences.
I wanted to ask a question about to ask you to expand on what you described the movement of the Hebe family with the end of the war to New York City, because I think some in our audience may be curious, why didn't they return to California? Can you tell us more about what drew them to New York and what kind of opportunities and community did they connect with there? You mentioned some of Hisako's employment, but could you paint a fuller picture of that period for them?
Yes, I'm curious myself too. And so I want to qualify that by saying um, I don't know for sure. I've seen a few hints at them thinking that California wouldn't be a good place to return to. And maybe New York, as the art center of the world, in their view, would be a good place to find employment. That turned out not to be true because I've gone through letters by Matsusaburo Hibi in the post-war years before he passed away, trying to look for jobs as an artist. And by the way, these letters are in the special collection at the University of California, Los Angeles. And you could read that he was rejected by this one, that museum, and that school. And so maybe there was a dream that New York would provide opportunities in the post-war years, and that didn't really turn out to be true. And as I mentioned, Hisako really had to work as a laborer in order to be able to support their family. But this question brings up an interesting point is that often we could only speculate, and almost the most direct way to have access to what they're going through is through art, the kind of art they produced. Right. So in the exhibition, we have Fight for New York by Hisako, and you could see from that painting what that supposedly hopeful and plentiful city was to her. Like it was almost like a nightmare. And then she also produced the painting Fear that's in Lackman's collection, which we couldn't borrow. Um, that is depicting her state of mind or emotional experience at the time. So we don't have written words per se, unless they had it sort of represented in text somewhere. But the paintings do give us some hint about what they were going through and why they were like that. Yeah.
Frightful New York is an incredibly evocative painting of
Yeah.
a state of mind. Um, I see a question that basically is reaching for more information around, I think, the terms and the impact of Executive Order 9066, which maybe you could just comment on, because it is such an interesting look, split in their trajectories at the point at which Hayakawa moves herself to New Mexico, we surmise, and Okubo and Hibi are among the thousands, the tens of thousands who were moved into camps in very short period of time. And the question is, how is it possible for one individual to get out and the other two ended up in the other direction? Maybe you could just give a little bit more context for that, Shipu.
Okay, I'll be brief on that because this is an immense field, and there are a lot of established scholars who have written a lot of work on this. So I'm not going to speak for them. As far as I understand, is that when the executive order was issued, if you were able or if you could choose, and I'm going to put choose in quotes, right? If you could choose to leave, you could go to other states out of the Western Defense Zone. But that was not an easy or possible option for a lot of people.
It was a
And so
very
we
short amount of time they were allowed for this.
that too, right? And then just imagine having to abandon everything you have and put them in a few pieces of luggage. And but it sounds like Hayakawa made that decision, moved, and but with some perhaps help from
Mm.
someone because I mentioned Matteo Latunic. I apologize if I pronounce his last name incorrectly, but he mentioned a older gentleman who helped Hayakawa move to Santa Fe in his note in his donation as well. So who that older gentleman was, could it be McCrossan already? We don't know. But if you have someone to be able to help you and say, okay, you can come to our state far away from that area, and maybe you could think about it. Maybe that was what she did at that time. And so they ended up having very different paths. Um, and there's always a question related to that, which is what did they do with their artworks? So I mentioned that the Hebe's artworks were stored or donated and stored with a local resident, but that got lost and we don't know what happened to them. Mini Okubo was able to put them in storage, and there are letters of her writing from Topaz requesting the US government to figure out how to send them to her,
Huh.
demanding that she deserved to retrieve her artworks. So they are obviously have different fate from that. displacement. Hayakawa, you could see from a lot of paintings that remerged or resurfaced or rediscovered, on the back there are labels of exhibitions from the 30s, San Francisco Art Association or Oakland Art Galleries exhibitions. And you could tell that she brought those canvases to Santa Fe or either kept them or repainted over them.
Well, I see that we are at 8 o'clock. So I'm going to close the program. Thank you so much, Shipu, for the exhibition and for tonight's talk. Thank you to our public programs team and everybody working behind the scenes. And thank you, everybody out there, for joining us. And please come see the exhibition if you're in Washington, here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. It's on view until August 17th. It's fabulous in person. Stay safe, everyone. Take care and good night.